My dear child, I watched you choose faith over fear when no one was watching, and every private choice you made in the dark was testimony in a closed-door hearing, whose verdict is being announced today in open court, in front of everyone, with the full visible weight of a reward that matches exactly what was proven behind those closed doors. Do not scroll past this. What I am about to reveal is not about eventually being noticed for quiet faithfulness in the general spiritual sense. This is about a verdict. A specific judge has reached a decision. The hearing is concluded. The courtroom doors opening verdict that was formed entirely from testimony no human being ever witnessed. Private choices for trust over panic. Quiet acts of believing when giving in to anxiety would have been understandable. Decisions made at 3 a.m. that cost you something real and produced zero recognition, because the entire battle happened behind closed doors. The hearing is over, the verdict is formed, and the announcement is today. You have been wondering whether the private choices mattered at all, whether choosing faith in invisible moments produces anything tangible when no one is there to see the choosing, whether the 3 a.m. trust and the silent composure and the choosing to pray instead of spiral decisions that you made without a single witness carried any weight in any system that could convert the invisible choice into a visible outcome. My beloved child, the private choices were testimony. Everyone entered into a sealed record by the only judge whose courtroom was in session during the hours no human court operates. The record is comprehensive. The evidence has been weighed, and the verdict that was formed from testimony the world never saw is about to be announced in the most public setting the judge's system contains. Stay here. What I reveal next is what the verdict says, and why the public announcement is calibrated precisely to the private faithfulness no one ever saw. Type verdict forming if you chose faith over fear in moments completely invisible to anyone else. Private decisions to trust when panic was more justified. Quiet composure when the internal world was anything but composed. And God just told you every unseen choice was testimony in a closed-door hearing whose verdict has been formed and is being announced today in open court with the full visible weight of a reward that matches exactly what was proven behind those closed doors. Before we go any further, I need to tell you something that genuinely surprised me. A neuroscientist discovered a simple 7-second technique that actually rewires how your brain processes thoughts. And when I tried it, the difference was almost unsettling. My focus sharpened, ideas started connecting faster, and that mental fog, gone. This isn't manifestation nonsense. It's backed by real brain science, and thousands of people are already seeing results. But here's the catch. Only 5 spots are left. If something inside you is saying, try it, trust that instinct, click the link in the description or pinned comment before it's too late. The closed-door hearing was not a single session. It has been in continuous session for every private moment you chose. Trust over fear across every season. The choosing was performed without witness, which means the volume of testimony the judge has been weighing is proportional to the number of invisible choices the viewer has been making in the dark without knowing each one was being entered into a sealed record. My beloved child, I need you to understand how a divine closed-door hearing operates. A human closed-door hearing is scheduled. It has a start time and an end time. The testimony is confined to the session. A divine closed-door hearing is continuous. In session, every moment the person being tried is making choices that constitute testimony. Every 3 a.m. decision was a session. Every silent prayer that replaced a spiral was a session. Every moment the composure was maintained while the internal world was collapsing, was a session whose testimony was recorded by a judge whose courtroom never closes. Every private moment of faith was a session, and the sessions have been accumulating. My dear one, the accumulation determines the verdict's weight. A verdict formed from a single session of testimony carries the weight of a single session. A verdict formed from the continuous accumulation of private sessions across seasons of invisible choosing carries a weight proportional to the accumulation, meaning the more private choices for faith over fear the person made, without anyone watching, the more testimony the judge weighed, and the heavier the verdict that is being announced in open court today. The verdict is heavy because the testimony was extensive, and extensive private testimony produces the heaviest public verdicts. This message was not released for everyone who has been faithful. This was aimed at the one person whose specific, continuous, nobody saw this. The entire battle happened behind closed doors. Accumulation of faith or fear choices has produced a sealed record whose volume exceeds what any public faithfulness could have generated. The person who does not know the volume of the private record is what determines the magnitude of the public announcement. Type sealed record. If every private moment of faith over fear was a session in a continuous closed-door hearing, and the volume of testimony accumulated across every invisible choice is what determines the weight of the verdict being announced in open court today, meaning the more private choices made, without anyone watching, the heavier the public verdict being delivered. Because extensive private testimony produces the heaviest public announcements the judge's system contains. I have been presiding over the closed-door hearing since the first private choice for faith was entered into the record, and the presiding has been the specific, judge level. I was in the room for every piece of testimony. Nothing was missed attention of a God whose courtroom was in session during every hour no human courtroom operates, and whose sealed record contains evidence the person giving the testimony did not know was being recorded. My dear one, not from a distant bench reviewing the transcript after the fact. From inside the hearing, in the room, present for the testimony as it was being given. The specific, the judge was watching when you chose trust at 3 a.m. The judge heard the prayer that replaced the spiral. The judge recorded the composure that was maintained while the interior collapsed proximity that a judge carries when the hearing is closed door and the only witness is the one presiding. I was the witness, and the witness was never absent from a single session. My beloved child, I watched the specific private choice that cost you the most. There was a moment, a specific, identifiable. The fear was at its maximum, and the faith was at its minimum, and the choosing happened anyway moment, where the testimony you entered into the record was produced, not from abundant faith, but from depleted faith. The choice for trust was not made from a position of strength. It was made from the specific I have almost nothing left to choose with. The fear is louder than the faith. I am choosing trust from the floor position that a person occupies when the private battle has consumed the reserves, and the choosing must be performed from what remains after the consuming. That testimony carried the most weight, because floor-level choosing enters the record at the heaviest weight the system assigns. I chose you for this message because the floor-level testimony was the piece the verdict was built around, not the confident choices, not the abundant faith decisions. The floor-level choosing that was performed at the moment the faith was most depleted, and the fear was most justified, and the choosing happened anyway without a single human witness in the room. My child, the most costly testimony carries the heaviest verdict. And the heaviest verdict produces the most public announcement. Type floor-level faith if God was presiding over the hearing when the most costly private choice was made. Faith chosen from the floor when the reserves were depleted and the fear was louder, and the choosing happened anyway without a single witness. And that specific testimony carries the heaviest weight in the sealed record because floor-level choosing enters the judge's system at the maximum weight assignment, and the piece the verdict was built around is the moment you chose trust from the position the choosing was most expensive to produce. I know what the invisibility of the choosing has been doing to the specific part of you where your belief that private faithfulness produces tangible outcomes is maintained, my beloved child. The invisibility was not incidental. It was structural. The battles that required the choosing were private battles, fought in rooms no one else occupied, at hours no one else was awake, during moments no one else was privy to. The privacy of the battle meant the privacy of the choosing, and the privacy of the choosing meant the absence of any witness who could confirm the choosing happened at all. No witness, no confirmation, no recognition. That has been the pattern, my child. I watched the absence of recognition produce its specific erosion at the layer where the connection between private faithfulness and visible outcome is maintained. The layer was intact at the beginning. The early private choices were sustained by the belief that God sees what is done in secret and rewards what is done in secret. The theological confidence that private faithfulness and public outcome are connected by a system the person choosing does not need to see operating in order for the system to be operating. The theological confidence held for a season, and then the season exceeded what the theology was fueling. I watched the exceeding produce the specific, body level. The theology says, this matters, but my experience says, nothing is changing disconnection that a person develops when the private choosing continues across enough sessions without a single visible outcome to see. My child, a closed-door hearing does not announce its verdict behind closed doors. The hearing is private. The verdict is public. The procedural design of the system places the testimony in the sealed room and the announcement in the open court, meaning the gap between where the testimony was given and where the verdict is announced is not a disconnection, but is the system functioning as designed. The system connects private testimony to public verdict by design, not by exception. My dear one, every private choice for faith over fear that was entered into the sealed record was a piece of testimony building toward a verdict the judge was always going to announce in open court. The retirement of the expectation did not change the destination of the proceedings. The proceedings were always aimed at the public announcement, and the person whose expectation was retired was a person whose hearing was approaching its verdict, while the person inside the hearing was concluding. The hearing was maintenance rather than proceeding. The hearing was always proceeding. The verdict was always forming, and formed verdicts are announced publicly, without exception. The judge just closed the sealed record, and the specific final page turned, all testimony weighed. The hearing is formally concluded. Closing that occurred in the closed-door chamber moments ago is producing the first atmospheric evidence that the proceedings are transitioning from private hearing to public announcement. My beloved child, something shifted within the last few days, not in the circumstances, in the atmosphere behind the circumstances, the specific, almost imperceptible something that was being decided just finished being decided. The air carries a finality. It did not carry before shift. that a person experiences when the closed-door hearing that governs their case reaches its conclusion, and the verdict's proximity to announcement begins affecting the atmosphere around the person whose testimony was the hearing's content. Something concluded, and concluded proceedings produce approaching verdicts. My dear one, I need you to understand what happens between the closing of the sealed record and the opening of the courtroom doors. The judge reviews the complete testimony. The verdict is formally inscribed. The announcement is prepared for public delivery, and the courtroom, the specific, open, public, everyone is about to be seated. The verdict is about to be read courtroom, where private testimony produces its public outcome, is being arranged for the formal announcement the system requires. The courtroom is being arranged for your verdict. Right now, I have been presiding over the hearing behind every season of invisible choosing, while the theology was holding, and the experience was contradicting, and the expectation was being retired, and the resignation was replacing the investment. I was in the sealed chamber, receiving each piece of testimony, weighing each private choice, recording each 3 a.m. trust, and each prayer instead of spiral, and each composure maintained while the interior collapsed entry into a record whose pages were filling while the person giving the testimony was concluding the record did not exist. My child, the record exists. The record is comprehensive. The judge just closed it, and closed records produce inscribed verdicts, and inscribed verdicts produce open court announcements. The announcement is being prepared for today. Type record closed if something shifted in the atmosphere within the last few days. A finality the air did not carry before. And the shift is the judge closing the sealed record after weighing every piece of private testimony the invisible choosing produced, meaning the closed-door hearing has formally concluded, and the courtroom, where private testimony produces its public outcome, is being arranged right now for the announcement of a verdict, inscribed from a comprehensive record the person giving the testimony did not know existed. I watched you choose faith over fear when no one was watching, and today I reward it publicly. The title carries that specific sequence because the watching and the rewarding are connected by the loop sealed record that converts the private watching into the public rewarding through the verdict. The judge inscribed from testimony the person giving it did not know was being entered into a proceeding aimed at an open court announcement. My dear one, I need you to understand the weight of the phrase, when no one was watching. The title does not say when few people were watching, does not say when only close friends were watching, says no one. No one is the closed-door qualifier. The specific, the hearing was sealed. No human witness was present. The only eyes in the room wear the judge's designation that identifies the testimony as the most private category the judicial system contains. No one watching testimony carries the highest judicial weight, because the choosing was performed without any human motivation to perform. My beloved child, this is directly connected to the title and to the specific wound the invisibility was producing. The title says, today I reward it publicly. Today. Not eventually. Not in a future season. Today. Because the hearing concluded, and the verdict was inscribed, and the courtroom is arranged, and the announcement does not wait for a future date once the proceedings are complete. The announcement is delivered at the first available public session after the verdict is inscribed. My child, the first available public session is today. The verdict is inscribed. The courtroom doors are about to open, and the gap between private faithfulness and public reward that the viewer has been experiencing as a permanent disconnection is about to be closed by the specific Today level, the judge is standing, the courtroom is opening. The announcement is imminent immediacy of a verdict whose delivery was always going to follow the hearing's conclusion without delay. The conclusion happened. The delay is not coming. And the announcement follows the conclusion the way open court follows closed doors. The courtroom doors are opening right now, my beloved child, and the specific bailiff announcing, all rise. The judge is entering the public chamber. The verdict is about to be read. Formality with which the open court session is commencing is producing the final moments before every piece of private testimony that was entered behind closed doors is converted into the most public announcement the judicial system contains. I need you to feel the proximity of the announcement, not the distant, God sees and God rewards in His time. Keep being faithful, and eventually it will matter proximity, that the retired expectation was producing as the default relationship between you and the possibility that the private choosing was aimed at anything visible. The present tense, doors opening, judge entering, verdict inscribed. The announcement is being read in the next moment's proximity of a public session, whose commencement means the private hearing has formally concluded, and the public outcome is no longer approaching, but is arriving. The doors are open, the judge is entering, and the verdict is in the judge's hand. My dear one, everything has been building toward these doors. The private choices made at 3 in the morning, without a witness. The prayers that replaced spirals no one knew were happening. The composure maintained while the interior collapsed, without a single eye observing the maintenance. The theology that held while the experience contradicted. The expectation that was retired while the choosing continued. The resignation that replaced the investment without changing the testimony the choosing was producing. The floor-level faith that entered the record at the heaviest weight. The sealed record that was filling while the person giving the testimony was concluding the record did not exist. And now, the doors, the open court, the public session, the announcement that converts every invisible choice into the most visible verdict the system produces. My child, the private testimony is about to become the public verdict. The invisible choosing is about to become the visible reward. And the gap between private and public is closing in the next moments of this message, with the specific courtroom level, the judge's reading, the verdict formality that matches the weight of every piece of testimony the sealed record contains. Type all rise if the courtroom doors are opening right now. The judge entering the public chamber with the inscribed verdict, and every piece of private testimony entered behind closed doors during every invisible moment of faith over fear is about to be converted into the most public announcement the judicial system contains, because the gap between private faithfulness and public reward is closing with courtroom-level formality in the next moments. And the verdict matches the weight of every choice that was made when no one was watching. The judge just read the verdict. The courtroom heard it, and the private faithfulness that was chosen behind closed doors by a person who believed no one was watching and no outcome was forming has just been announced in open court with the full, formal, public weight of a reward calibrated precisely to the testimony that was entered during every invisible moment of choosing faith, when fear was the more available and more justified response. My beloved child, this is the moment the closed doors open and the sealed record speaks, and the private becomes public, and the verdict that was formed entirely from testimony no human witness ever saw is announced to every ear in the courtroom with the specific. The judge has ruled, the evidence was weighed, the reward is being delivered formality that the judicial system produces when the private hearing concludes and the public announcement commences. The moment the person who wondered whether the invisible choosing mattered at all hears that post-verdict expectation exceeds pre-retirement expectation. Because post-verdict has evidence the pre-retirement was operating on theology alone, and the quality of the choosing is being permanently upgraded. The person whose next private choice for faith over fear is made after receiving the open court verdict chooses with a quality neither the investment era nor the resignation era choosing carried. The specific, I now know the courtroom is in session. Every choice is testimony. The system connects private to public quality that post-verdict choosing produces in a person whose sealed record just spoke publicly. The choosing just became testimony-conscious, and testimony-conscious choosing produces the highest weight entries. Type system confirmed. If the disconnection between private faithfulness and public outcome just collapsed under the verdict, the retired expectation reinstated at evidence-based level, the resignation converting back to investment, the choosing upgraded to testimony-conscious quality, because the open court announcement proved the system connects invisible choosing to visible reward through the procedural design of closed-door hearings producing public verdicts, and the person whose sealed record just spoke publicly now knows every future private choice enters a courtroom that is always in session. Let me show you what your life looks like now that the verdict has been announced and the private has become public, and the system connecting invisible choosing to visible reward has been confirmed by the courtroom. Because a person whose closed-door hearing just produced an open court verdict moves through the world at a rewarded faithfulness capacity the disconnected version could never sustain. My dear one, the first thing that changes is the choosing. You have been choosing faith over fear in private, with the maintenance quality of a person whose expectation of tangible outcome had been retired. The specific, I am doing this because it is who I am, not because I believe it produces anything quality that resignation era choosing generates in a person whose theology retained the practice, while the experience eliminated the anticipation. The choosing just became testimony-conscious, and testimony-conscious choosing changes the private battle entirely. My beloved child, the mornings change permanently. You have been waking into the disconnection, the first conscious awareness of each day, processing the familiar. The private choices I make today will produce no visible result. The choosing is maintenance, not proceeding condition, that the retired expectation was installing as the default morning reality. Tomorrow you wake into the verdict. The morning processes at a different level because the courtroom confirmed the connection, and confirmed connections produce a morning whose private choosing carries the weight of testimony that builds toward verdicts rather than maintenance that builds toward nothing. Verdict mornings carry the courtroom. Disconnected mornings carried the resignation. The private choices ahead of you are entering a courtroom that is already in session for the next hearing. The verdict that was just announced publicly was the verdict of the previous hearing. The next hearing has already commenced, and every private choice for faith over fear made after the announcement is testimony being entered into a new sealed record whose verdict will be announced in the next open court session. The system is continuous, and continuous systems reward continuously, not once. People around you are going to notice the verdict before you describe the testimony, because a person whose private faithfulness just produced a public reward carries an atmospheric authority that the disconnected resignation era maintenance choosing version could never generate, regardless of how consistently the private choosing was being performed. During the seasons the expectation was retired, my beloved child. The ones who knew you during the disconnected season, who interacted with the maintenance faithfulness version, who received the I am still choosing, but I no longer expect the choosing to produce anything energy, who sensed the specific quality of a person, whose private spiritual practice was genuine, but whose anticipation of tangible connection between the practicing and the living had been quietly eliminated by the accumulated invisibility of the choosing. Those people are about to encounter the verdict-announced version. They will say something shifted in your circumstances that they cannot explain. They will be witnessing the open court announcement. My child, there is a specific quality a person carries when private testimony that no human being witnessed produces a public verdict that every surrounding eye can see. The quality is not earned success. It is the specific, I did not produce this through visible effort. The reward arrived from a proceeding no one knew was in session. The judge ruled from evidence. The public never saw quality of a person whose visible reward is traceable to invisible testimony through a system the surrounding people have no access to audit. The quality is judicially vindicated faithfulness. And judicially vindicated faithfulness attracts what maintenance faithfulness could not. Connections that require the specific atmospheric quality of a person whose God converts private testimony into public verdicts are approaching the verdict-announced version right now. There are partnerships and assignments whose formation demands the specific. The private produced the public. The invisible generated the visible. The system connects the two authority that only a person whose closed-door hearing just announced its verdict in open court can carry. My dear one, what approaches judicially vindicated faithfulness is calibrated to the testimony the verdict was built from. And testimony-calibrated connections exceed anything the disconnected version was encountering. Type judicially vindicated if the verdict is producing an atmospheric authority the maintenance faithfulness version could never carry. The specific private testimony produced public reward. The judge ruled from evidence no one saw quality of judicially vindicated faithfulness. And connections requiring the specific weight of someone whose God converts invisible, choosing into visible. Verdicts are approaching because testimony-calibrated partnerships were always positioned in the system waiting for the open court announcement to bring the verdict-carrying person to the coordinates the partnerships occupy. I need you to understand why I conducted the hearing behind closed doors rather than in open court from the beginning. Because the closed-door design reveals something about the kind of testimony I was always looking for that an open court hearing could never have produced. My beloved child, I could have conducted the hearing publicly. Every choice for faith over fear would have been made in front of witnesses. The choosing would have been visible. The testimony would have been observed. And the person making the choices would have received the immediate recognition that public faithfulness produces in the people watching the choosing happen in real time. Public choosing produces witnessed faithfulness. Private choosing produces pure faithfulness. And I was looking for pure. My child, pure faithfulness is faithfulness performed without the fuel of human recognition. A person choosing faith in front of witnesses is choosing with two fuel sources: the internal conviction that the choosing is right and the external validation that the witnesses provide by observing the choosing. A person choosing faith behind closed doors is choosing with one fuel source, the internal conviction alone. And single-source choosing produces testimony whose purity exceeds what dual-source choosing can generate, because the testimony is uncontaminated by the performance the audience would have introduced. Pure testimony weighs heavier in the sealed record, and heavier testimony produces heavier verdicts. My dear one, I chose you for the closed-door hearing because the assignment embedded in the public verdict requires a person whose testimony was proven pure by the absence of any audience during the entering of it. The assignment ahead requires someone whose faithfulness was never fueled by human recognition, because the assignment will place the person in positions where human recognition is unavailable, and the faithfulness must be sustained on single-source conviction alone. The closed-door hearing proved the purity. The purity qualifies for the assignment, and the assignment is what the public verdict is opening access to. The doubt surfacing right now is using the most invisibility-hardened objection in its inventory. The voice that says the public verdict might not be traceable to the private choosing, and that the visible reward arriving right now could be coincidence rather than the judicial outcome of testimony entered in a hearing no one knew was in session, my child. It sounds like this. Good things happen to people regardless of whether they chose faith in private moments. The reward could be timing. The reward could be circumstance. The reward could be the natural progression of events that would have occurred, whether the private choosing happened or not. Attributing the visible reward to the invisible choosing is the spiritual interpretation of what might simply be a favorable turn that has nothing to do with 3 a.m. trust, or prayers that replaced spirals, or composure maintained while the interior collapsed. That doubt just applied coincidence logic to a judicial proceeding. I know the exact night that produced the testimony the entire verdict was built around. The specific private moment where the faith over fear choosing was performed at the highest cost the choosing has ever carried in the viewer's entire history of private battles, producing the single heaviest piece of testimony the sealed record contains, and the single most weighted entry the judge has ever recorded during any session of this particular hearing, my dear one. Not the first private choice, not the most recent, the most costly, the specific night where the fear was so justified and so loud and so physiologically present in the body that the choosing of faith required the person choosing to override every system the body was deploying in favor of the fear, the survival level. This is not a spiritual exercise. This is a physical override choosing that occurs when faith and fear are no longer competing as ideas, but as bodily systems, and the person chooses faith against the body's own insistence that fear is the appropriate response. My beloved child, I know that night, because the judge was at the closest proximity the judicial system permits when the override was being performed. The override is the moment the testimony reaches its maximum weight, because testimony produced against the body's own objection carries a judicial weight that testimony produced from comfortable conviction cannot match. Comfortable conviction chooses from abundance. Physical override chooses from the specific. The body says, fear and I am choosing trust. Anyway, defiance that produces the heaviest entry the sealed record can receive. The override night testimony is the centerpiece of the verdict. My child, the God who was at the closest proximity during the override night is the God confirming tonight that the public reward being announced in open court is weighted to the override, meaning the magnitude of the public verdict is proportional to the cost of the private choosing on the night the choosing was most expensive, and the most expensive choosing produced the most significant verdict the hearing has ever generated. The most private night produced the most public reward, and the producing was always the system's design. Type override night. If God just identified the specific night, the faith over fear choosing was performed at its highest cost, the body deploying every system in favor of fear, while the person chose trust against the body's own insistence. And the override night testimony is the centerpiece of the verdict, because testimony produced against the body's own objection carries the maximum judicial weight the sealed record can receive, meaning the most private and most costly moment of choosing is producing the most public and most significant reward the open court announcement contains. Now that the verdict has been announced, and the private has become public, and the system has been confirmed, and the override night testimony has been identified as the centerpiece of the reward, there is one thing I need you to do, my beloved child. And it is the instruction that determines whether the public verdict is received at the full weight the sealed record produced, or whether the disconnection theology interferes with the receiving by maintaining the private faithfulness produces no tangible outcome framework inside a person whose tangible outcome is standing in front of them in open court. Receive the verdict, not deflect the reward with the specific, "This cannot be connected to what I chose in private." Good things just happen, sometimes deflection, that the disconnection theology produces in a person whose system was trained to separate the invisible choosing from the visible outcome. Not minimize the verdict by processing the public reward through the maintenance expectation filter that was installed when the anticipation was retired. Receive the verdict at the full weight the judge inscribed it with. In the open court, the judge announced it in. With the specific, "This reward was produced by my private testimony." The choosing mattered. Every session was recorded acknowledgement that converts the receiving from passive coincidence acceptance into active verdict reception. My child, receiving the verdict is a specific act of reconnection. The disconnection separated the private from the public. The receiving reconnects them. The specific, "I accept what I chose in the dark produced what is arriving in the light," reconnection that the verdict requires the person receiving it to perform, because the system produced the connection, but the person must accept the connection for the verdict's full weight to land on the life the choosing was performed inside. When the receiving begins, the deflection will resist. The deflection was installed by seasons of invisibility, whose accumulated evidence trained the system to classify private faithfulness as disconnected from tangible outcome. Override the deflection with the courtroom. The courtroom is open. The verdict was read. And courtroom verdicts are not coincidences the deflection can reclassify. Receive. The private produced the public, and the producing is confirmed. You made it to the open court, my beloved child, and I need you to stand in the verdict long enough to feel what it means, to hear your private faithfulness announced publicly by a judge who was in the room for every invisible moment of choosing and whose sealed record contains the testimony of every 3 a.m. trust and every prayer that replaced a spiral and every composure maintained while the interior collapsed choice that no human being ever witnessed. Feel the verdict, not the invisibility, not the seasons of private choosing that produced no recognition and no confirmation and no visible evidence that the choosing was building toward anything tangible, not the retired expectation that converted the faithfulness from investment to maintenance. not the foolishness that almost attached itself to the act of continuing to choose faith. When the choosing felt like speaking into a courtroom the person believed was empty. The verdict. The specific judge inscribed, testimony weighted, publicly announced. The private produced the public. The invisible generated the visible. The system connected what the disconnection said could never be connected. Verdict that is being delivered right now in an open court to a person who wondered whether private choosing mattered at all. The verdict says it mattered. And mattered sounds like the opposite of everything the invisibility was teaching. I want to thank you for something the invisible choosing made almost impossible to sustain. Thank you for choosing faith at 3 a.m. when the fear was louder and the room was dark, and the choosings cost something real, and no one was there to see the cost being paid. Thank you for the override night when the body said fear and the spirit said trust, and the choosing was performed against the body's own insistence without a single witness to validate the overriding. My dear child, thank you for the private faithfulness, because the private faithfulness was the testimony, and the testimony produced the verdict, and the verdict is being announced right now in the most public setting the judge's system contains, converting every invisible choice into a visible reward, whose weight was calibrated precisely to the cost of each choosing performed behind closed doors by a person who did not know the courtroom was in session. Let the tears come, not invisibility tears, not maintenance tears, verdict tears. The tears of a person standing in open court, hearing the judge announce a reward, whose weight matches the exact cost of every private choice for faith over fear, undone by the discovery that the private was never disconnected from the public, and that what was chosen in the dark was always being recorded by a judge, whose courtroom was always in session, and whose verdict was always aimed at the most public announcement the system contains. Type verdict tears if tears are forming right now because the judge just announced the public reward of every private choice for faith over fear. And the tears are not the grief of the invisible seasons, but the vindication of a person whose 3 a.m. trust and prayer instead of spiral and override night faith was always testimony in a closed-door hearing, whose verdict was always aimed at this open court announcement. And the private was never disconnected from the public, and the choosing always mattered. And the mattering is being declared right now to every ear in the courtroom. You are not the person choosing faith in invisible rooms, wondering whether the choosing matters anymore, my beloved child. That identity, the one whose private faithfulness was performed without a single human witness across seasons long enough to thin the automatic confidence that the choosing was producing anything tangible, the one whose expectation of visible outcome was retired, while the choosing continued on resignation fuel rather than investment fuel, the one whose theology retained the practice while the experience eliminated the anticipation, the one whose override night produced the most costly testimony the sealed record contains by choosing trust against the body's own insistence, that fear was the appropriate response in a room where the only other presence was a judge. The person did not know was presiding. That identity was permanently retired the moment the courtroom doors opened and the verdict was read, and the private became public and the sealed record spoke, and every invisible choice for faith over fear was announced as the testimony that produced the most significant public reward the judicial system has ever delivered over this specific life. You are the person standing in the verdict now, and standing in the verdict changes everything the invisibility was teaching. The disconnection identity that governed your relationship between private choosing and visible outcome. The retired expectation that converted the faithfulness from investment to maintenance. The resignation that replaced the anticipation. The foolishness that almost attached itself to the act of expecting response from a proceeding the person did not know was in session, and the invisibility that made every private choice feel like it was being performed in a courtroom no one was presiding over, has been permanently abolished by the evidence of a public verdict whose weight was calibrated precisely to the sealed record the judge maintained. Through every session, the person giving the testimony did not know was being recorded. My dear child, the private was never disconnected from the public. The system always connected them, and the system just proved it. From this moment forward, you carry the identity of a person whose God conducts closed-door hearings and announces open court verdicts. Not a person whose private faithfulness produces no tangible outcome. A person whose every invisible choice for faith over fear is testimony being entered into a sealed record, whose verdict will be announced publicly with the full weight of everything that was weighed behind closed doors. Not a person who chooses in the dark and wonders